Today, we're looking at American history and focusing on the surge of lynchings after the Civil War, and especially after Reconstruction. I also want to share my discovery of a superb online research tool that apparently no one knows about, and which really opened up this topic for me. I haven't done any history videos because I haven't got the advanced creative skills that most of the really big YouTube educational channels exhibit, with animated finger puppets and pie charts and maps with vivid primary colors. If you rely on that sort of thing to stay engaged, well, you've come to the wrong channel. If, on the other hand, you'd like to learn about a widely misunderstood but monumental period of American history through the eyes of a brilliant and dedicated researcher, no, not me, then I'd invite you to stick around. A little context before we begin. My general understanding of lynching throughout the South was that it had been a response to the failure of Reconstruction. After the war, Southerners suddenly found that they had a lot of freed blacks running around, acting all uppity and shit, reading, going to school, buying their own land and livestock, voting, running for political office, and similar outrages by which decent white folk were deeply offended. I sensed that during the pre-war period, the slave years, there would have been some lynchings, perhaps, of free blacks, but certainly not slaves, because they were expensive and useful. Don't get me wrong, slavery was monstrous, buying and selling people, branding them, and splitting up families. It's about as evil as it gets. Corporal punishment was common, and sometimes severe, because resistance was common. Escaped slaves would certainly have been punished very harshly. There was a great deal of rape and abuse. Enslaved women and girls were treated as sexual conveniences. There would have been a lot of casual verbal abuse as well. Slavery denies its victims the sense of security that we all get from continuity in our lives, from community and family. Now, I don't wish to sound insensitive, but the hard-nosed reality is that there was a real economic incentive to provide a minimum of care, to clothe, house, and feed slaves and treat them as valuable property, which is how most planters thought of them. In the photographic record, we see large plantations with what look like army or prison barracks, people with poorly fitted, hard-wearing clothes, children without shoes, overcrowded accommodations, and in people's faces, you see the kind of cosmic weariness one gets from constant stress brought on by eternal insecurity. We often see scars from corporal punishment, but we rarely, if ever, see malnourished slaves. This was a fairly stable world. White supremacy was simply assumed. It was baked into society, an embedded fact of Southern life. Even whites disposed toward kindness saw blacks with a sort of comic affection, understanding them as people certainly, but not college material, let's say.
The boss said for us to be back at the store at 4 o'clock.
What time is it now, Action?
Let's see. There it is.
Sure is.
Yeah.
The institution of black bondage provided comforting reassurance that the social order couldn't possibly change. And I think that's why we don't see a lot of slavery-era whites exhibiting the pervasive, paranoid fear and boiling hatred of blacks that characterized the post-Civil War South. If slavery implied order and continuity, emancipated blacks, in contrast, implied chaos. They were seen, by the very fact of their newfound freedom, as a challenge to white supremacy and therefore a threat to Southern society. Reconstruction is when we see draconian measures like the Black Codes, convict leasing, sharecropping, poll taxes and literacy tests and Jim Crow regulations emerging as manifestations of white America's paralyzing panic at the thought of working-class and middle-class blacks competing successfully with whites. There were signs. During Reconstruction, a surprising number of black folks were elected to local, state, and even federal offices. 16 served in the United States Congress. Another 500 or so were elected to state legislatures, and several hundred others held local offices in Southern communities. Pro-slavery Democrats would put a stop to it all, with poll taxes and literacy tests to prune back the black vote, with segregation, with the black codes, which made it trivially easy to arrest a black person and charge them with some petty violation like loitering and sentence them to prison where their labor could be leased out to private employers, with the state confiscating all of their earnings, so they couldn't even work off a fine. Someone else would have to pay it to get them out. Remember, the 13th Amendment forbids involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. Ever wonder why that exception appears? Well, now you know. It's the same reason why the Social Security Act and National Labor Relations Act, both of 1935, excluded agricultural and domestic workers, most of whom were black, but I digress. Finally, Jim Crow laws ensured that freed blacks could be relegated to inferior legal and social status with inferior prospects at every step from the cradle to the grave. Separate but equal was a bald-faced lie. Reconstruction and its aftermath. This is the period when I would expect to see lynchings get out of control, as Southern whites panicked and sought every conceivable weapon and trick to maintain their social, political, and economic advantages. So what is lynching? Here's what I think. It always starts with an accusation that some law or community standard has been violated. The act of lynching itself, I would define that as public, extrajudicial capital punishment. And it has two objectives. The first is to assert white supremacy, quite simply by exercising it, and the second is to terrorize the black population as a means of social control. Lynching is the exercise and also the enforcement of white supremacy through an extravagantly violent and terrifying spectacle. I'd go so far as to suggest that part of its purpose was to terrorize whites as well. These white mobs would have included spectators, cheerleaders, and a core of actual hands-on murderers or butchers. All of them would have felt the momentum of the mob and thought to themselves how easily they could be swept up if the mob should turn against them. I think lynching was partly a message to nonconformist whites, warning them that so-called race traitors would be dealt with just as brutally as any black man. I don't believe that this level of paranoid hatred was common during the slave years. My hypothesis is that the 70-year period from Reconstruction's failure, say around 1875, until the end of the Second World War in 1945, is when Southern whites would have been the most panicky about black social and economic competition, such that lynching would have surged as a way to manifest their neurotic fear. So I started looking for reliable records of lynchings arranged by date and location to test my hypothesis. I found some documents at the Tuskegee University website, but they only covered lynchings from 1882 to 1968. And of course, I wanted to see the trend starting from the pre-war period of widespread slavery because I suspected it would tell a different story. I did eventually find what I was looking for, but before we get to the good stuff, I'd like to share a few facts from this simple data set that surprised me. Here are the totals of lynchings by state and the victim's race for the period of 1882 to 1968. There are places in America where only whites were lynched, and places where white victims greatly outnumbered blacks. For example, Arizona, 31 whites, 0 blacks. California, 41 whites and 2 blacks. Colorado, 65 and 3. Of course, Georgia is exactly what we'd expect, with 39 whites and 492 blacks, and Mississippi with 42 and 539. No surprises there either. Massachusetts is missing, I assume because there were no lynchings. New York and New Jersey, 1 and 1 each. Remember, California was 41 and 2? Well, New Mexico was 33 and 3. Oregon, 20 and 1. Wyoming, 30 and 5. So there must be something to the myth of frontier justice. And it doesn't appear to have been racially motivated against blacks, although I think Asians, Mexicans, and indigenous people had a fairly difficult time in those parts. Looking by years, we see that even in the South, whites were lynched more often than blacks until we get to around 1880 or 1890. Then the ratio changes to favor blacks, and whites gradually disappear from the data until they become a trivial statistic around 1930. After World War II, black Americans trail off as well. Okay, that kind of conforms to what I was thinking, but I needed that earlier data. The Tuskegee University Online Archive is where I found the information I just showed you, so I kept poking around using different search terms and found what looked like the mother lode called the Monroe Work Compilation. And a link here, and a link there. Notice, this is exactly what I'm looking for, starting with data from 1834. And here we go. Bloody hell! Anyway, I came at this from a number of angles, using various search terms, and I never made it past this point. So the next thing I looked for was the map, because it also starts with 1834 data. So follow that link, and another link, and bloody hell again. I had no idea what Monroe Work referred to. Monroe sounded like a place name to me, so I went searching. And I quickly found this website called Monroe and Florence Work Today, where I learned that Monroe Work is a person's name and that the person named was a dedicated researcher who was married to another dedicated researcher named Florence. So Monroe and Florence Work, née Hendrickson, were a couple who assembled an extensive database of lynchings by date, place, name, race or nationality, and even the charge against them. So, everything I had hoped for. Using this interactive map that's based on their data, you can dig down to individual victims, nearly 5,000 of them. This is a wonderful addition to the study of American history. It gives you a personal sense when you see the names. These are people, not just statistics. I found it fascinating just to click at random and see who pops up. Here's Ben Bryant, who was accused of murder. I see there's some uncertainty about Will Atwater. We'll zoom in a bit. The darker orange marks are black folks. Here's George Williams, accused of threatening whites, whatever that means. George Holden lost his life for writing insulting notes to a white woman. George Robinson, accused of murder. The blue ones are foreigners. Federico Villarosa, a Sicilian accused of rape. An unnamed Sicilian with a labor dispute. Vincenzo Serio, accused of murder. The green ones are white folks. F. Watt Daniel, lynched for angering the Klan. William Pierce Mabry, another white man lynched for... Wait, what? He was lynched for protecting a black woman from a beating. See, this is terrorism, meant to intimidate everyone challenging white supremacy, regardless of their color. The pale orange ones are Mexicans, like poor Charlie Williams, accused of robbery and murder. Now, you can exclude and include whatever data you like. I've excluded victims of race riots and strike riots, armed disputes, the Civil War, and other causes of death in favor of the very conservative lynching criteria that the works preferred. They did that to avoid criticism for selecting data too liberally, which would inflate the figures, so they were very strict. And now to answer the question that got me here. Was I right in thinking that lynchings were rare during the slavery decades, but became an expression of moral panic during and especially after Reconstruction? Well, here are the facts. Let me scroll from 1948, a couple of years at a time. I think the map starts here because there were so few incidents earlier. And there's very little going on in this section of the timeline. I'm a little clumsy here, so bear with me. I'd say it's clear that slaves were rarely lynched, as I suspected. Not to say they weren't brutalized in myriad ways, just not in that particular way. Right at the end of the Civil War here, and there's a little activity in North Carolina. I don't mean to trivialize anything. You will soon see why I'd call that a little activity. There's Kentucky starting to light up a bit too. We're at around 1870 now, during Reconstruction, and North Carolina and Kentucky are getting pretty active. We're at around 1878, after Reconstruction, and the cancer is spreading throughout the South. By now, Reconstruction has failed and it will be abandoned permanently. It starts getting crazy from here. Hold on to your butts. We're at around 1890 now. Look at this. And moving on, notice in the broad strokes, we can see the same areas lighting up repeatedly. I'll show you that from a different perspective in a bit. When we get to 1930 or so, the rate really drops off, although it doesn't disappear until the 1960s. Moving the slider to exclude pre-Civil War data has little effect on the whole picture. Same with removing the post-World War II data. Now let's look at the whole map. Earlier, I noted there were marks appearing repeatedly in certain locations. In this cumulative view, they appear as clusters, although the time involved is the better part of a century. You can zoom in on the clusters and get a sense of the local flavor. Are there consistencies within the clusters for the victim's race or the type of offense that would draw a lynch mob? Is the data distributed evenly over time or compressed into a brief period? So, yeah, the sustained frenzy of paranoid violence kicks off after Reconstruction and remains steady until the Second World War. This coincides with the Black Codes and Jim Crow and obsessive segregation for everything from major public institutions like schools and hospitals down to fucking water fountains, and a neurotic terror of miscegenation. Which is ironic because planters used to regard their female slaves as naturally available for sexual exploitation. But put black men with white women and holy Jesus, what a panic. So much that the United States Congress passed the Mann Act in 1910, a federal law custom-made to punish this delightful rascal. So it's clear. The terrorist practice of lynching was reserved for free blacks and even white allies, both of whom were far more threatening to the traditional power structure of the white Southern Democrats. For a little postscript here, I haven't been able to learn much about the works. I can tell you that Monroe graduated from the University of Chicago with a degree in sociology. He would later work with W.E.B. Du Bois doing research, and later was offered the job of establishing the Tuskegee Institute's Department of Records and Research by Booker T. himself. Today, I think Monroe and Florence would be disappointed in Tuskegee University's online archive of their data. It's fragmented and poorly organized and incomplete, really not worthy of their names. Here's a better picture of Monroe. I couldn't find a better picture of Florence or any information about her that's not already posted on the Today website. I'll call that a serious oversight in American historical research. Incidentally, they're buried together at the Tuskegee University Campus Cemetery. So, 1875 to 1945. A truly savage period in America's recent past. As if the genocide of the indigenous population, slavery, and the Civil War weren't quite savage enough. It's incredible to me that even white Southerners were unsafe if they showed concern for black lives. There was a real terrorist regime in the Deep South keeping everyone in line, which highlights how courageous the American civil rights protesters were. One question that people might be asking themselves is whether the institution of slavery was worse than the period of Jim Crow and lynching, or vice versa. That's the kind of question someone asks when they want to defend one or the other. I'll say this once. slavery and Jim Crow were equally evil and destructive to black lives, just in different ways.